I knew something was wrong the moment the sleeper's eyes opened before the monitors said they should. Down here in the Abyssal Lab, nothing happens early unless something else wakes it. I was new when they handed me the list of 11 rules. Strange, strict instructions, they said, would keep me alive, though no one would tell me why. I remember the first time I broke one of those rules. How the room shifted as if the ocean itself had noticed. I can still feel the weight of that mistake, pressing against the glass behind me, waiting for me to slip again. I kept staring at the chamber's dim control panel, trying to steady my breathing as I reminded myself of Rule 1. Never approach a sleeper until the chamber confirms they're fully human. The figure inside the capsule hadn't moved since those eyes opened, but the monitors still showed the same low activity they always did when someone was unconscious. My supervisor, Haynes, insisted the equipment never failed, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the sleeper's gaze had followed me when I stepped back. I told myself that fear was making me imagine patterns, but the longer I watched, the more certain I became that nothing about this awakening was normal. Haynes finally walked in behind me, muttering something about calibration delays, though I could tell from the tension in his shoulders he was lying. He didn't even look at the chamber at first. He went straight to the console and checked the biometric logs with almost frantic precision. When he finally turned to face the sleeper, he kept his hands behind his back, like he didn't trust them not to shake. I wanted to ask him why he seemed just as nervous as I was, but he cut me off with a quiet warning to keep some distance until the system confirmed what we were dealing with. That wording alone unsettled me far more than the open eyes inside the capsule. "What exactly do you mean by that?" I whispered, though my voice cracked midway. Haynes didn't answer immediately, and when he finally did, his voice was low, as if he didn't want the figure inside to hear. He said the chamber sometimes misread the early stages of emergence, especially when the sleeper's physiology wasn't fully stabilized. His explanation didn't make sense, yet the way he said it made me feel like he was leaving something important out. I couldn't escape the idea that he wasn't confused at all. He was afraid of something he'd already seen before. The dim corridor lights flickered for a moment, enough to cast shifting shadows across the glass. In the distorted reflection, the sleeper's face appeared slightly different than it had a moment earlier, though I couldn't place what had changed. I blinked hard and leaned closer without thinking, trying to catch the detail I'd missed, but Haynes grabbed my arm sharply before I got too close. He didn't shout, but the pressure of his grip made it clear he thought getting nearer would be dangerous. He didn't need to say anything. His expression said enough. He guided me a few steps away and told me to stay put while he recalibrated the neural sensors. I watched him work, noticing how he avoided making direct eye contact with the sleeper, as if doing so might trigger something. He typed quickly, his brow furrowed in concentration, and each time the console let out a soft indicator tone, he flinched like he expected something worse. I asked him whether early awakening had ever happened before, but instead of answering, he only said some cases in the past had forced them to rewrite protocols. That didn't ease my nerves in the slightest. The chamber released a soft release of pressure, and for a moment the figure inside appeared to shift its weight, though I couldn't tell if it was an intentional movement or the result of the adjustment. The slow rising and falling of its chest seemed off rhythm, not quite matching the gentle hum of the chamber's stabilizers. I remember thinking that if it was breathing, then surely the monitors should have picked up something more than the faint, steady lines they displayed. Haynes noticed the same thing, because he kept checking the panel with increasing frustration. "I don't care how new you are," he whispered, still avoiding the chamber with his eyes. "If the system hasn't confirmed everything yet, you don't take one extra step forward, not here, not ever." His tone was hard enough to silence any question I might have had. It wasn't a reminder, and it wasn't a lecture, it was a warning carved from something that had clearly happened before, something he wasn't willing to describe. I nodded slowly, though the sting in my arm where he'd grabbed me earlier still pulsed with anxiety. We stood there in uneasy silence until the chamber's confirmation scan began, its screen circling through layers of biometric assessment. The process usually took about a minute, but this time each stage lingered unnervingly long, as if the system struggled to decide what it was reading. Haynes shifted his weight, tapping his finger against his thigh in a rhythm that didn't match anything in the room. I kept watching the sleeper, noticing tiny changes in its posture that I swore hadn't been there seconds before. Maybe it was just the shifting light, or maybe the figure was moving in ways too subtle for the sensors to detect. The final stage of the scan blinked on screen, though no confirmation appeared, only a soft red indicator that pulsed once, then faded. Haynes's shoulders tightened, and he leaned closer to the console with a kind of dread that made the hair on my arms lift. The system wasn't giving a rejection or an approval, it was giving something in between, something it didn't have the language to categorize. I asked him what that meant, but he only shook his head and exhaled slow, as if steadying himself for something he hoped wouldn't happen. "Step back," he murmured, not even looking at me. "All the way to the wall, slowly." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that rooted me to the floor for a moment before I forced myself to move. I backed up until my shoulders touched the cold metal surface behind me, and when I finally looked at the chamber again, I noticed something that sent a tremor through my chest. The sleeper's eyes weren't just open, they were watching us, not shifting, not darting, not blinking, just fixed directly on where we stood, as if it had been waiting for us to notice. Haynes froze when he saw the same thing. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though the water pressing in from all sides had crept into the space with us. He whispered something too quietly for me to catch, then reached for the manual emergency override, but the moment his fingers brushed the switch, the chamber lights flicked from blue to a muted murky green. I didn't know what that color meant. It wasn't part of standard protocol. Haynes seemed to know though, because all the color drained from his face in an instant. The sleeper slowly raised its hand inside the capsule, the movement eerily smooth despite the thick liquid it floated in. The gesture wasn't violent or sudden, it was more like someone waking from a dream and reaching for whatever voice they heard in their half-conscious state. Except this time, the monitors still read no neural spikes, no muscle activity, nothing that indicated voluntary movement. The panel insisted nothing was happening, the figure inside insisted otherwise, and then the chamber began to hum at a deeper pitch, its glass surface vibrating, although no alarm sounded. Haynes grabbed my shoulder again and whispered, "Don't react, don't speak, stay absolutely still." His voice trembled just enough to betray his fear, and a cold realization settled over me. He wasn't trying to protect me from the sleeper. He was trying to keep the sleeper from noticing me. The hand inside the chamber pressed against the glass, its palm flattening slowly, the fingers aligning with deliberate precision. The green light deepened, casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment everything felt frozen. The hum from the chamber grew heavier, resonating not just through the floor, but through my ribs, like a low, searching pulse. Haynes whispered something I couldn't make out, and then he turned sharply toward me. "Don't look away," he murmured. "Whatever you do, don't turn your back." Not until we understand what the scan missed, but before I could respond, the figure inside tilted its head with a slow, unnatural grace. And I realized something. Not only was it aware of us, it seemed to recognize us. The chamber lights flickered again, the hum deepened. Something was about to happen. I didn't fully understand why Rule 2, keep your reflection away from any active chamber surface, mattered until Haynes pulled me farther from the capsule, his grip cold and almost desperate. The sleeper's hand stayed pressed against the glass. Its dark eyes locked on us, as though studying the way the dim light shaped our faces. The reflection on the curved surface shifted with our movements, warping into shapes that didn't quite match our real gestures. I noticed a faint outline beside my reflection that shouldn't have been there, and the subtle discrepancy sent a wave of unease crawling up my spine. Haynes held me still with a firm hand and stared at the panel, his breath shallow as he whispered something under it. The console flickered through diagnostic cycles faster than I'd ever seen, each scan resolving into more corrupted data. Nothing was matching the sleeper's image, but the system wasn't rejecting it either. That limbo, that strange half-accepted biometric reading, told me the machine wasn't confused. It was hesitating, Machines don't hesitate unless what they're reading doesn't belong on their classification list. He signaled me to stay close to the wall while he slowly approached the chamber again, moving with deliberate steps like someone trying not to provoke a wild animal. Even then, he didn't let his face drift too near the reflective glass. I watched closely and noticed how the sleeper's eyes followed his silhouette, not his actual movement, as if tracking the mirrored image instead of the real body. That made me wonder whether the thing inside didn't see us directly at all, but interpreted us through the distorted reflections bending across the surface. I asked him what the chamber was reacting to, and he shook his head with a tense, frustrated motion. "It's reading both of us," he muttered, "but not the way it should." His voice sounded strained, like he was choosing every word cautiously, shaping them around something he didn't fully want to admit. I realized then that he wasn't just afraid of the sleeper awakening early. He was afraid the chamber knew something he didn't want to tell me. Something about what it meant when the scans refused to classify a form. The sleeper's hand slowly began to slide across the inside of the glass, tracing a faint line as if following something unseen outside the chamber. The path it drew didn't align with any real feature in the room. Instead, it seemed to outline the distorted trace of my own reflection. I stepped farther back without thinking, pressing myself against the wall, hoping the angle kept my reflection away. Haynes caught the movement and shot me a warning look that said I'd done the right thing. His eyes flicked between me and the sleeper with a worried intensity that made my stomach turn. He adjusted the console, overriding the auto-stabilization settings and forcing the chamber into a strict containment cycle. The lights shifted to a colder hue, and the hum changed pitch slightly, making the air feel heavier. Even though it was subtle, the sleeper reacted immediately, its head tilting with unnatural precision toward where Haynes stood. It seemed to sense the shift the way some deep-sea creatures sense electric fields rather than motion or sound. The eerie stillness of its gaze made me realize just how delicate the situation was becoming. Haynes tried to reassure me that the containment cycle should force a proper reading, but he didn't sound confident. "The system will classify it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction, "and then we'll know what we're dealing with." But the way he avoided my eyes told me he feared a different outcome, that the system wouldn't be able to classify anything at all. If that happened, I wasn't sure what came next. The lab protocols never mentioned this scenario, and the manual sampling procedures were strictly forbidden. The chamber lights glowed brighter for a moment, before dimming again, stabilizing into a consistent rhythm. The sleeper stiffened in place, every muscle freezing as though waiting for something. I felt a strange pressure fill the room, an almost imperceptible weight that settled over my shoulders and made the air harder to breathe. Haynes exhaled slowly, probably assuming the containment had taken hold, but I couldn't stop watching the sleeper's eyes. They didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't waver. It was like they were waiting for a cue, and we didn't know what that cue would be. When the confirmation sequence began, the monitor displayed a pulsing field around the sleeper, mapping its biology layer by layer. The first few readings were normal: bone density, muscle structure, hydration levels. Then halfway through the cycle, the scan paused and held on a distortion, a strange blur that seeped outward like ink bleeding through paper. The scan line jittered in place, as though fighting interference from something inside the chamber that wasn't supposed to be there. Haynes cursed under his breath, but kept his eyes on the monitor. I asked what caused a distortion like that, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the screen, where the blur began shifting shape, almost mimicking the shape of the chamber interior. Something was responding to the scan, but not in a way that suggested pain or fear. It reacted as though it understood it was being analyzed. That realization made my heart race harder. The sleeper wasn't a passive subject anymore. It was an active observer, responding to whatever the machine tried to uncover. Haynes stepped back slowly, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked unsure of what to do. The chamber's hum deepened again, and the red indicator light pulsed with slow, rhythmic precision. The sleeper's hand pressed harder against the glass, and I saw the faint outline of its palm shift, the shape subtly deforming, as if adjusting to a different structure underneath. I felt myself go cold as the thought hit me. Was the reflection shifting because of the glass, or because the figure inside was changing to match what it saw? The confirmation scan reached its final stage, and the room grew unbearably quiet. Haynes stared at the screen, waiting for the result that would tell us if the sleeper was safe to approach. The machine processed the last line of data, holding us in suspense for several long seconds. Finally, the result flashed across the monitor in muted, steady text. But there was no classification, no acceptance, no rejection. The screen simply displayed one impossible word: unknown. The moment the word appeared, the sleeper moved with a suddenness that made Haynes stagger backward. Its hand left the glass, curling slowly as though preparing to grip something, though nothing in the chamber was within reach. Its head tilted again, this time far enough that the movement looked almost inhuman, a deliberate test of its own range, as if adjusting to a new form. The green light deepened once more, bathing the chamber in a murky glow that made the sleeper's outline blur at the edges. Haynes whispered for me to stay calm, but I could see in his eyes that even he didn't believe calm was possible anymore. He reached for the manual lockdown lever, the only mechanism capable of sealing the chamber completely. But before he touched it, the sleeper's eyes shifted again, not toward him, not toward me, but toward the reflection on the glass where both our shapes merged in a distorted silhouette. The chamber lights flickered sharply, and then the glass surface began to ripple. I remembered the warning clearly, as I glanced at the empty pod across the lab, realizing too late that my curiosity had pushed me close enough to see movement where there shouldn't have been any. Rule 3. Never wake anyone who isn't on the roster, flashed in my mind as a caution I hadn't fully appreciated until now, when a slow, shallow breath escaped from a sleeper that had no authorization to exist. The monitor should have flagged it immediately, but the screen stayed blank, almost pretending nothing was happening. Haynes appeared at my shoulder, eyes wide with panic, whispering, "Step back. Whatever you're seeing, it's not supposed to be here." I froze, my stomach tightening, feeling the air around the pod grow heavier with anticipation. The figure inside shifted ever so slightly, barely visible in the dim glow of the chamber lights. Its fingers flexed against the glass, tracing patterns I couldn't recognize. My instincts screamed to check its identity, but every part of me hesitated, knowing the moment I did, I might trigger something irreversible. Haynes backed away as well, keeping his hands close to the control console. His usual calm had been replaced with a tense alertness I hadn't seen since the first day I walked into the lab. Every step we took felt like it was measured against the sleeper's awareness, though I had no proof it could sense us directly. I thought about how the lab roster worked. Every name, every ID tag, every biometric detail logged meticulously. There were no anomalies, or so the system was supposed to claim. But now, staring at the pod, I realized the protocols we followed religiously might be insufficient. This sleeper had no file, no recorded entry, and yet it existed here, breathing and reacting. Haynes muttered under his breath, almost to himself, that the last time something like this happened, the lab almost didn't survive. I didn't ask for details. The fear in his eyes said everything. The hum of the chamber grew deeper, settling into a low vibration that resonated through the floor beneath our boots. I could feel it in my chest, a constant pressure that made every heartbeat feel louder than it should. The figure's eyes shifted slightly, catching the reflection of the lights above and turning them into a distorted mirror of the lab. It was impossible to tell if it was watching me, Haynes, or just the distorted reflections in the glass. I realized then that Rule 3, never wake anyone who isn't on the roster, wasn't just a guideline for safety, it was a rule for survival. I wanted to step back, to create distance, but the lab felt suddenly smaller, every wall pressing in like the abyss surrounding us outside. Haynes whispered again, barely audible, "It can sense hesitation, don't let it know we see it." I didn't understand what he meant, but every instinct told me he was right. The sleeper's movements were subtle but deliberate, calculated with a precision that no human could naturally achieve. My pulse accelerated as I tried to convince myself that it was just a reflex, a byproduct of the chamber's life support system, but deep down, I knew better. The monitors blinked sporadically, trying to process the presence of an unregistered life form. Numbers jumped, biometric logs glitched, and the sensors emitted readings that didn't correspond to any known pattern. Haynes was typing furiously, adjusting parameters, trying to force the system to acknowledge or reject the sleeper, but nothing worked. It was like the chamber itself hesitated, caught between recognizing something alive and refusing to admit it existed. The uncertainty made my stomach knot tighter with every passing second. Suddenly the sleeper shifted its posture entirely, rising slowly within the pod. Its movements were almost fluid, a glide that seemed impossible given the density of the water and the confines of the chamber. Haynes backed away, whispering, "Stay calm, don't panic, don't do anything stupid." I couldn't stop myself from staring at it, the unnatural precision of its motion making every instinct scream at me to run. But the lab doors were far, the corridor winding, and I knew that one wrong move could change everything. Its head turned, a slow, deliberate rotation that made my stomach drop. The eyes locked on me for a moment that felt like eternity. There was no blinking, no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a dark, calculating awareness. I realized then that waking an unauthorized sleeper might not just be dangerous, it might be a provocation. Every protocol we had rehearsed in training felt meaningless against the silent intelligence in that pod. Haynes' grip tightened on the console, and I could feel his tension radiating toward me like a warning. The chamber's water began to ripple subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the figure inside was responding to our collective tension rather than any external stimulus. I could see tiny distortions in the glass, lines forming shapes that weren't there before. My hands shook slightly as I resisted the urge to touch the console or move closer. Haynes kept muttering measurements, adjusting variables, but the screen remained blank, an absence of data that felt heavier than any warning lights ever could. I felt trapped between curiosity and survival, and every instinct screamed at me that this was the exact point Rule 3 was meant to prevent. Then the figure's hand pressed flat against the glass, and I could see faint, almost human-like impressions in the reflection of the water. The gesture wasn't violent, but it was deliberate, and it carried an unsettling intelligence that made my skin crawl. Haynes whispered for me to stay back, moving slightly in front of me to shield my reflection from the glass. I realized then that this wasn't just about waking someone unauthorized, it was about what happened if the wrong eyes noticed you. The sleeper's gaze followed me even as I tried to retreat, as if it could sense the fear emanating from my body. A soft pulse ran through the chamber, sending tiny vibrations across the floor and walls. I felt it in my chest, in my throat, in my trembling fingers. The figure inside seemed to respond to the pulse, bending its posture in time with an invisible rhythm. Haynes whispered, almost to himself, "If it detects your heartbeat, it's already inside your mind." I tried to ignore him, tried to rationalize it, but I couldn't stop the cold shiver that ran from my spine to my neck. The pod seemed alive, more aware than it should have been, and we were dangerously close to testing the limits of the unknown. Finally, after what felt like endless seconds, the chamber emitted a soft hum, and the sleeper sank back into a subtle sway, its movements barely perceptible. Haynes let out a shaky exhale, his face pale and drawn. "It stabilized, for now," he muttered, his voice more fragile than I had ever heard. I knew then that even a momentary lapse, a glance or gesture too long, could have drawn it out fully. Rule 3 wasn't just a precaution, it was a boundary between life and a slow creeping death. And yet, even as the immediate tension eased, I felt a lurking awareness that this was far from over. I stepped back from the pod, pressing my palms against the cool metal of the wall, feeling every tremor, every vibration, every shift in the air. Haynes adjusted the chamber controls, ensuring the unauthorized sleeper remained as inert as possible. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that inert didn't mean safe. I could feel a presence in the room, something beyond human comprehension, something that existed because Rule 3 had been ignored even once before. I didn't speak, I didn't move, I couldn't risk it noticing me again. Then, as if testing the limits of patience, the sleeper's hand moved slightly once more, tracing the condensation on the glass. Its motion was subtle, deliberate, and impossibly controlled. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing shallow, realizing that every second we remained in that room was a negotiation for survival. Haynes whispered for me to stay calm, but even he wasn't sure anymore what calm meant down here. The pod seemed to pulse with a silent rhythm, one that wasn't mechanical or biological, but something else entirely. Something aware, something waiting. The lights in the chamber flickered for a moment, bathing the figure in a strange green hue. The reflection distorted across the glass, and I caught a glimpse of shapes moving where there shouldn't have been any. The air itself seemed heavier, thicker, as though the unseen weight of the abyss had entered with the sleeper. And then I felt it, a prickling sensation along my neck, a silent recognition that whatever we'd woken, however briefly, was now observing us in a way that defied reason. The pod remained still after that, but I knew as Haynes backed away slowly toward the console that this was far from over. Whatever danger Rule 3 sought to prevent wasn't just lying dormant, it was patient, calculating, and aware of every mistake we made. My pulse raced, my hands trembled, and the sense of impending consequence settled over me like the ocean pressing down from above. One false move, one misstep, and the consequences would ripple through the lab with the slow inevitability of the deep itself. The first time I learned Rule 4, never let the lights go out in the observation corridor, I thought it was an exaggeration, a precaution for paranoia, rather than a survival necessity. But as I stepped down the narrow passage between chambers, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The reflection of the sleeper's capsules stretched and twisted unnaturally along the corridor, and I realized how easily a sudden blackout could make a human body, or something else, disappear into those shadows. Haynes followed behind me, muttering about emergency protocols, but his unease was evident. The corridor seemed to press in on us, almost alive with the anticipation of darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the flickering lights ahead, but my eyes kept darting to the pods. Some were empty, some housed sleepers we had confirmed, but one capsule remained dark, unregistered, and still. I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing on my shoulders. Haynes whispered that even a brief power failure here could trigger unpredictable reactions from the unconfirmed sleepers. I wanted to ask why, but the words caught in my throat, drowned by the oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow our movement as we advanced down the corridor. The lights flickered again, and I cursed under my breath, pressing the override panel to stabilize the voltage. The hum of the corridor dimmed as the system compensated, but I could sense something changing in the shadows. Haynes slowed, his hands brushing against the cold metal wall for guidance. "Stay close," he murmured, almost to himself. "If the lights fail even for a second, it notices things we can't control." I nodded, though my heart pounded in a way that made the air feel thick, as if each beat carried a warning I couldn't interpret yet. As we approached the far end of the corridor, I glimpsed the unregistered pod again, barely visible in the low glow. The outline inside seemed to shift subtly, reacting not to us, but to the fluctuations in the corridor lighting. I realized then that Rule 4 wasn't about seeing clearly. It was about preventing the unknown from perceiving us through its own distortions. Haynes's voice came again, low and tight. "Don't look away, never let it get used to the dark." I could feel the truth of his words in my chest, a cold dread that settled deep in my bones. The lights flickered once more, the kind of momentary blackout that could go unnoticed if you weren't paying attention. My vision blurred with the sudden darkness, and I swore the shadows inside the pods thickened, pressing against the glass as if curious. Haynes's hand gripped my shoulder firmly, and his whisper was sharp with urgency. "Move forward, slowly. Don't stop. Don't panic." The corridor stretched on, longer than it should have, and each step echoed faintly, though the emptiness swallowed most of the sound. Every fiber of my body tensed with anticipation. I tried to measure my breathing, to control my racing pulse, but every flicker of light felt like a warning. My mind wandered to the other sleepers, imagining what might happen if the corridor plunged into full darkness. The unregistered figure inside the pod didn't move, but I felt its awareness pressing through the glass, stretching into the shadows that threatened to swallow the hallway. I understood then that Rule 4 wasn't just about avoiding a blackout. It was about keeping the abyss itself from seeping into our space. Haynes adjusted the corridor's voltage again, stabilizing the flicker, and we continued forward, moving past the empty pods and the confirmed sleepers alike. My gaze lingered on each one, wondering how the presence of darkness might alter them. Every capsule seemed to contain potential threats, waiting to take advantage of the slightest lapse. I could feel the unregistered sleeper watching, analyzing, as though understanding the exact moment when one of us might falter. The thought made my hands clench into fists, nails digging into my palms. At one point, I stumbled slightly on the grated floor, the lights above strobing faintly in response to a micro-fluctuation in the power. Haynes's hand shot out, steadying me, and he hissed, "Even that small motion can be detected. Remember Rule 4. His eyes were fixed on the far end of the corridor, where the darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible. I swallowed hard, nodding, though I could feel the chill of imminent danger crawling along my spine. The corridor wasn't just a passageway. It was a test of endurance, perception, and absolute discipline. As we neared the central junction, the lights began to pulse irregularly, a subtle variation that made the shadows stretch unnaturally. I caught a movement in one of the unregistered pods, slight enough that I wasn't sure I really saw it. Haynes froze beside me, whispering urgently about compensating manually for fluctuations. My heart raced as we worked to stabilize the lights, but the feeling of being observed never left me. I realized that Rule 4 was less about illumination and more about control over the unknown entities that existed silently in the deep. The flicker finally subsided, leaving the corridor bathed in a steady, artificial glow once more. Haynes exhaled sharply, but his eyes never left the pods. I tried to calm myself, to suppress the panic that threatened to rise in my chest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in those few moments of instability. The unregistered sleeper's presence seemed heavier, more acute, and I understood why the rule existed. Darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it was a weapon, and every second of shadow gave it power. We continued to the junction, the air heavy with the anticipation of what might be lurking beyond the bend. Haynes whispered once more, "The lights, they're not just for us, they're for control. Don't underestimate what darkness can reveal." I nodded silently, too aware now that each corridor, each pod, each flicker of light had meaning far beyond what I could comprehend. The tension pressed down on me, like the pressure of the abyss outside, reminding me that we were not in a place for mistakes. Suddenly, the corridor shivered subtly, the lights dimming for just a fraction of a second, but long enough to make every reflection stretch and bend. I felt the unregistered sleeper respond instantly, a subtle shift inside its pod, almost imperceptible. My stomach sank as I realized that even a momentary lapse could provoke a reaction. Haynes's hand shot to the console, correcting the minor fluctuation, but the warning was clear. Rule 4 wasn't just about keeping visibility, it was about survival. One false step, and the darkness would become a conduit for what waited. The lights steadied fully, but the oppressive awareness didn't lift. I felt every shadow, every reflection, every subtle movement in the corner of my vision. Haynes motioned forward, and we continued cautiously, step by step. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, each pod now a potential danger, each shadow a possible threat. I realized fully now that breaking Rule 4, even for a second, could allow whatever lay in the darkness to reach beyond its capsule, beyond our control. The corridor wasn't just a passage, It was a cage, and the lights were the bars that kept something at bay. As we approached the central junction, the green hue of the emergency lighting began to pulse faintly, though nothing triggered it. I glanced toward the unregistered pod again, and the shape inside seemed to lean slightly toward the wall, as if testing the limits of perception. Haynes didn't notice it yet, focused entirely on maintaining the corridor's illumination. I felt a creeping dread in my chest, understanding that what the lights concealed could be watching, learning, and adapting even now. Every step we took was a negotiation with the unknown, every shadow a potential trap. A sudden ripple passed through the floor panels beneath us, subtle but unmistakable. The lights held steady, but I could feel the change, a vibration almost like a pulse, emanating from deep within the lab. Haynes tensed, glancing around, and whispered, "It's testing the boundaries. Rule 4 exists for moments like this." I nodded, unable to speak, every nerve screaming in silent alarm. The corridor stretched before us, and the awareness of what might be hidden in darkness weighed heavier than the pressure of the ocean outside. And then, at the far end of the junction, the lights flickered once more, not a failure, not a pulse, but a deliberate shift that made every shadow elongate unnaturally. I realized with a shiver that the unregistered sleeper was responding, waiting, and that the corridor itself had become a threshold for something far older and far more intelligent than any of us had been prepared to face. I didn't move, couldn't move, as the subtle ripple coursed through the floor, carrying a silent warning that the lights were fragile, and so were we. I had ignored it once, thinking it was an unnecessary precaution, but Rule 5, always secure the hatch before interacting with any capsule, became painfully real the moment my hand hovered over the unregistered pod. Haynes's eyes snapped toward me, panic evident, and he hissed under his breath about consequences that couldn't be reversed. The hatch's locking mechanism glinted under the overhead lights, cold and metallic, and I realized that even a small lapse could allow something inside to react in ways we couldn't predict. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I moved slowly, every instinct warning me not to touch anything until the hatch was fully engaged. I reached for the control panel to secure the hatch manually, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on my shoulders. Haynes stood behind me, tense, his fingers hovering over the override buttons like a safety net. The unregistered sleeper inside the pod shifted slightly, a subtle motion that didn't match the mechanical hum of the chamber. It was deliberate, purposeful, and aware of our presence. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as I completed the lock sequence, hearing the faint click that signaled the hatch was secured. The tension didn't ease once the hatch was locked. The figure inside began a subtle rotation, its eyes tracking the reflection of the lights along the lab floor. It didn't move like a human, and yet it seemed to understand the boundaries we were enforcing. Haynes whispered about prior incidents, how ignoring this rule had led to permanent containment failures. My stomach nodded with every word, and I realized the margin for error here was almost non-existent. Even securing the hatch didn't guarantee safety. It merely delayed the consequences. I backed up slowly, my gaze never leaving the pod. Haynes muttered something about emergency protocols, but his tone lacked conviction. The figure inside flexed its fingers against the glass, tracing shapes that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't violent, but it was testing us, probing the limits of our control. My mind raced through every scenario we'd trained for, every contingency plan, but none of them accounted for this level of awareness. I felt the room shrink around us, the air thickening, as if the pressure from the abyss outside had found its way in. As I adjusted my position, I noticed the slight distortions in the glass reflecting our images back at us. The unregistered sleeper seemed to study our mirrored movements, calculating our patterns, learning. I realized then that securing the hatch wasn't just about containment, it was about maintaining an illusion of control. One wrong movement, one lapse in protocol, and the figure inside could exploit it. Haynes's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, a reminder that we were both accountable for every motion, every hesitation. The monitors flickered, scanning the pod repeatedly, yet every reading returned an anomaly. The system couldn't classify the sleeper, couldn't register its existence properly, as if it operated outside normal biological parameters. Haynes's brow furrowed with frustration, but even he couldn't hide the underlying fear. I watched the unregistered figure, feeling the weight of Rule 5 pressing down on me. One mistake here wouldn't just be a procedural error, it could mean losing control entirely. I moved closer to the console, checking the containment status and ensuring every emergency lock was functioning. The figure inside tilted its head, observing, learning, aware of our diligence. It wasn't aggressive yet, but the intelligence it displayed was unnerving. Haynes muttered that previous failures had led to casualties in similar scenarios, and my stomach tightened. Every second felt heavier, the corridor lights reflecting off the capsule glass in long, distorted lines. I could sense the sleeper adapting to our presence, probing our habits, testing the boundaries of what we considered safe. The green glow of the chamber shifted slightly, and I realized the light itself could trigger reactions if the hatch wasn't fully engaged. I adjusted the panel again, double-checking the locks, feeling a subtle vibration beneath my feet. Haynes's eyes were wide, scanning every monitor, every indicator. The air in the lab felt charged, dense with anticipation, and I understood then that Rule 5 was as much about timing and precision as it was about mechanical safety. Even the smallest oversight could have consequences we weren't prepared to face. A subtle movement from the pod drew my attention, a curling of fingers, almost testing the boundaries of the hatch. I froze, feeling the cold metal beneath my palms and realizing how fragile our control really was. Haynes whispered for me not to move, to stay still until the system fully acknowledged the hatch's engagement. The unregistered figure seemed to understand the limits imposed, waiting, almost patiently, for any misstep. My hands shook slightly as I confirmed every lock, every latch, every safety measure, hoping it was enough. Suddenly, the chamber hummed deeper, a low vibration running through the floor. The unregistered sleeper's head tilted sharply, following something I couldn't see. I realized with a chill that the hatch didn't just protect us physically, it separated our perception from whatever was inside. Haynes adjusted the console again, muttering about stabilization, and I felt the first real trace of dread press into my chest. Rule 5 wasn't merely precautionary, it was a shield against something ancient and intelligent, something aware of even our smallest errors. We stepped back, our eyes locked on the capsule, and I could feel a presence in the shadows of the lab, lingering just beyond the light. Haynes whispered that even with the hatch secured, the sleeper could influence its surroundings in ways we didn't understand. The idea made my pulse hammer in my chest, each beat echoing the realization that our control was tenuous at best. I didn't speak, didn't move, and didn't dare blink. The lab, once familiar, now felt like a stage for something entirely unpredictable, waiting for the moment we faltered. The unregistered sleeper shifted again, slower this time, almost imperceptibly. Its gaze seemed to reach through the thick glass, measuring our reaction, calculating patience and timing. I could feel the air growing heavier, the walls pressing closer, and Haynes remained tense, fingers hovering over emergency overrides. Every procedure we followed, every precaution we enacted, now seemed like a fragile barrier against an intelligence we barely understood. The hatch secured us physically, but it could not secure our awareness from the unregistered figure inside. The lights flickered briefly, a subtle pulse through the corridor, and I realized how fragile the equilibrium truly was. I watched the reflection of our forms in the capsule glass, stretched and distorted, and the unregistered figure seemed to respond to that distortion as much as to our actual presence. Haynes whispered one last warning before moving to a nearby console. Even a second of hesitation could undo everything. Rule 5 exists for a reason. My chest tightened as I nodded silently, understanding fully that the consequences of failure weren't hypothetical, they were imminent. The unregistered sleeper remained still for a moment, then tilted its head in an unnatural, deliberate motion. I realized that even with every hatch locked and every monitor reading stable, something alive, aware and calculating had learned the limits of our precautions. The lights in the corridor glowed steady now, but the oppressive presence of the sleeper pressed on, a silent warning that Rule 5 was just the beginning. Every breath I took felt measured, controlled, like even the air itself could betray us if we let it slip. And then, as I moved slightly to readjust my stance, a faint vibration ran along the floor, subtle, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I froze, realizing with a chill that the unregistered figure might be testing the boundaries of the hatch itself. Haynes stiffened beside me, eyes darting between the console and the pod. The pressure in the lab intensified, a slow, heavy reminder that the abyss outside was watching, waiting, and that Rule 5 was only a fragile barrier. I had thought I could handle the unregistered pod on my own, but the moment I realized Rule 6, never interact with the capsule alone, the weight of isolation pressed down on me like the ocean above. The lab corridor stretched empty behind me, the faint hum of the overhead lights the only sound, and I felt the oppressive awareness of the unregistered sleeper, in a way I hadn't before. Haynes had left only moments earlier to check another section, leaving me alone with the pod, and the air grew suddenly thick, suffused with tension that seemed almost tangible. Every instinct screamed at me to step back, to call for help, but the lure of curiosity and the urgency to understand rooted me to the floor. As I approached the capsule, the subtle shifts in the unregistered sleeper's posture became more pronounced. Its eyes followed me with deliberate calculation, measuring every inch I moved, every breath I took. I reached the console beside the pod, my hand hovering over the controls, feeling the chill radiate from the glass, as though the figure inside could sense my hesitation. The rules had warned against acting alone, yet here I was, already violating the one safeguard meant to prevent disaster. I whispered into the empty corridor, asking myself if Haynes would have stopped me, but no answer came, just the silent, unwavering gaze from inside the chamber. I started the manual override sequence, keeping my movements deliberate, but a creeping unease crawled up my spine. The unregistered figure shifted, curling its fingers against the inside of the glass, a subtle pressure that mirrored my own tension. It wasn't trying to harm me, but there was a definite awareness behind the motion, an intelligence probing my every action. I realized then that Rule 6 wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. It was about survival itself. The moment I was alone, I became a variable it could manipulate, a single point of failure in a system that demanded two. The console displayed the pod systems and environmental controls, but the readings were slightly off, subtly inconsistent, as though the capsule itself was resisting complete transparency. I reached for the input panel, my fingers trembling slightly despite my attempts to stay steady. The air in the lab seemed to tighten, pressing around me in waves, making each breath a conscious effort. I reminded myself to adhere to the procedures, to be precise, to maintain control, yet the awareness of the unregistered sleeper's eyes made each step feel like a negotiation with something far older and more intelligent than I could comprehend. I adjusted the chamber's life support settings carefully, following the sequence etched into my memory, but the figure inside mimicked my motions subtly, flexing its hands and tilting its head in response. It wasn't an exact imitation, but enough to make me realize that it was studying me, learning patterns, recognizing habits. Rule 6 had warned me, interaction without backup wasn't just dangerous. It allowed the sleeper to anticipate my decisions. My pulse quickened as I thought about what could happen if it used that knowledge. The hum of the lab seemed heavier now, resonating with something that wasn't mechanical, something alive. I stepped back momentarily to assess the console, taking shallow breaths to steady my racing heart. The unregistered figure followed every movement, leaning slightly toward me in a way that defied normal physiology. I remembered the earlier incidents Haynes had whispered about, times when a lone technician's curiosity had provoked an irreversible reaction. My hands hovered over the final control input, and a shiver ran down my spine as I realized I was walking the thin line between adherence and catastrophe. The lab was silent, but it wasn't empty, and the pressure of isolation made my skin crawl. I started the final override command, careful to maintain the sequence exactly as outlined in our protocols. The capsule's internal environment adjusted, and I noticed subtle changes in the way the figure inside shifted, almost as though it were testing the effects of my actions. I realized in stark clarity that interacting alone had given it insight, an understanding of cause and effect I wasn't meant to provide. Haynes's warnings echoed in my mind, never alone. I had ignored him, and now the consequences were tangible in the way the sleeper observed, patient, calculating, waiting for a single error to exploit. The temperature inside the lab seemed to fluctuate slightly, and I felt a low, pervasive pressure that made every step feel weighted. The figure's gaze didn't leave me, unblinking, unwavering. I realized I had become an extension of the capsule itself, a participant in its silent tests, each motion measured against an intelligence that didn't conform to human comprehension. My breathing grew shallow as I completed the sequence, fully aware that the moment I moved away, the unregistered figure could act, analyze, or react in ways I couldn't predict. Rule 6 existed to prevent this, yet I had violated it. I considered stepping back and calling Haynes, but hesitation gripped me. Even a second's delay could invite attention. The unregistered figure's eyes seemed to follow my thoughts, reading intent, anticipating motion. I realized that solitude had made me vulnerable, turned every decision into a potential trigger. Rule 6 wasn't merely about oversight, it was about preventing the sleeper from gaining insight into human behavior. I took a measured step toward the exit, hoping to leave the interaction complete, hoping the momentary lapse wouldn't have lasting consequences. The capsule shifted slightly as I moved, the figure inside tilting its head in a deliberate, unhuman way. Its posture seemed to test the limits of the environment, pushing against unseen boundaries, probing for weakness in the system. I froze, recognizing the gravity of being alone in front of it. Haynes's absence amplified my vulnerability, and I felt the oppressive weight of the lab press down, like the crushing pressure of the deep ocean outside. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but every movement was measured, careful, a delicate negotiation with something incomprehensibly aware. A subtle vibration ran through the floor beneath me, and I realized with a shiver that the capsule itself might be capable of affecting the lab's structure, even slightly. The unregistered figure remained still in terms of the obvious, yet every subtle movement it made suggested awareness, intelligence, and patience. I understood fully then why Rule 6 existed. Interacting alone allowed the unknown to analyze and predict. My pulse hammered in my chest as I pressed the final confirmation button, hoping the lockout would prevent further influence, hoping my singular presence hadn't given it a permanent advantage. I stepped back slowly, eyes never leaving the capsule, and felt the corridor's air tighten, as though it had its own consciousness. Haynes's shadow appeared at the corner as he returned, and relief surged through me, but the unregistered figure's posture remained deliberate, patient, and aware. The lab felt smaller now, denser, as if every breath I took added to the weight pressing in. I realized that interacting alone had done something irreversible. It had granted the sleeper a measure of understanding, and we had no idea what it might do with that knowledge. The corridor lights flickered briefly, though they remained operational, and I noticed the unregistered figure's eyes track the slight shadow movement. Haynes placed a hand on my shoulder, and for a moment I felt the tiniest fraction of safety, though I knew it was fragile. The capsule hummed quietly, stable, yet the presence inside was unmistakable, patient, and calculating. Rule 6 had been broken, and even if we survived the moment, the repercussions of my solitary interaction were far from over. And then, just as I exhaled in tentative relief, the figure inside the pod shifted once more, and the subtle movement seemed to hint at knowledge it shouldn't have possessed. I froze, every nerve in my body taut, realizing with cold certainty that interacting alone had left a mark. The lab, the corridor, the lights, they all seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the consequences to manifest. Rule 6 wasn't just a guideline, it was a boundary, and crossing it had awakened an awareness we weren't prepared to confront. I had always underestimated the power of silence until Rule 7, never speak near a sleeping subject, reminded me just how dangerous words could be in this lab. Walking past the unregistered pod, I realized that even the faintest whisper could trigger a reaction from something we barely understood. Haynes had stopped beside me, his lips barely moving as he pointed to the monitor, and yet the tension was palpable, as if the sleeper inside could hear not just sound but intention. My throat tightened, and I found myself clamping it shut, realizing that even the hum of my breathing might carry meaning here. The lab, once a place of sterile observation, now felt alive with an unseen awareness, waiting for the slightest lapse. I stepped slowly down the corridor, every step measured, my voice caught entirely within me. The unregistered figure's head tilted, tracking my reflection along the glass, and I understood why the rule existed. Words could provoke, reveal, or even invite awareness from sleepers who were meant to remain dormant. I felt a chill as I remembered past warnings whispered among senior staff about technicians who had spoken carelessly near a pod. Their presence had not just been disrupted, they had triggered reactions that were irreversible, and some had vanished without a trace. Haynes signaled me forward, hands raised slightly to indicate caution, and I followed silently, each motion exaggeratedly careful. The pod's glass seemed to hum faintly, a subtle vibration I couldn't explain, as though it responded to the tension in the room. I realized that Rule 7 wasn't simply about preventing disturbance, it was about controlling perception. The sleeper inside wasn't only asleep in a biological sense, it was aware in ways that defied explanation, attuned to vibrations, energy, and the smallest cues. Speaking, even innocently, could invite its attention in ways that silence alone could prevent. As I adjusted the environmental controls beside the capsule, I felt Haynes's eyes on me, a constant reminder that even one wrong word could undo hours of careful observation. I glanced at the unregistered figure again, noticing subtle shifts, the curling of fingers, the tilt of the head, the almost imperceptible reaction to the corridor lights. My pulse quickened as I realized that silence was a shield, one that we could not afford to lower even for a moment. Every breath, every movement, was now loaded with significance. I had learned that speaking was not merely audible, it was detectable, influential, and potentially dangerous. I reminded myself to breathe softly, each inhalation deliberate. As I stepped closer to the console, the monitors flickered slightly, though the environmental readings were stable, and I sensed the sleeper inside adapting to our presence. It wasn't just watching, it was analyzing, absorbing, and possibly predicting our reactions. Haynes whispered, nearly inaudibly, that past incidents had proven a single careless word could trigger changes in sleeper behavior, sometimes catastrophic. My throat tightened further, the weight of the rule pressing down, reminding me that Rule 7 was less about communication and more about survival. I began inputting the necessary adjustments, my fingers trembling slightly from tension. The unregistered sleeper shifted again, an almost imperceptible movement that mirrored my own, and I realized the terrifying possibility that it could sense more than just sound. It reacted to intent, to the minute changes in posture and the rhythm of my breath. I understood then why the rule was so strictly enforced. Any spoken sound could carry meaning, could provoke thought, could invite influence from something we weren't prepared to face. The corridor felt smaller, the lights harsher, the shadows deeper, as if the lab itself was a participant in the silent negotiation. Every instinct told me to step back, but I needed to complete the environmental calibration, to maintain the stability of the pod. Haynes stood just behind me, silent, watching both the monitors and the capsule. I felt the unregistered figure's awareness pressing outward, subtle but insistent, measuring my hesitation. I kept my focus on the console, ignoring the urge to speak, to explain, to react. Rule 7 had become a lifeline. Speaking here was more than a breach of etiquette. It could compromise our control, our safety, even our survival. I adjusted the last parameter carefully, noting the subtle shift in the capsule's internal readings. The unregistered figure remained motionless, yet I sensed a tension, a barely perceptible focus that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I realized fully that even a whisper of curiosity or fear could carry weight in this room. Haynes nodded toward the monitor, signaling that the calibration was complete, but I felt the continued presence of awareness from inside the pod. The silence we maintained was not empty. It was a living boundary, separating our reality from the sleeper's perception. The corridor lights flickered faintly as I stepped back, a minor fluctuation that made the shadows stretch unnaturally. The unregistered figure shifted in tandem, as if responding to the smallest inconsistencies, testing the limits of the environment and our compliance with Rule 7. I froze, realizing that the mere act of moving while maintaining silence required more concentration than I had ever imagined. The lab felt charged, alive, as though every particle of air could carry meaning. Haynes remained vigilant, a silent anchor, reminding me that speaking or even thinking aloud could have consequences far beyond comprehension. As I cleared the console area and stepped toward the corridor exit, I felt a subtle pressure, as if the capsule itself had extended some awareness beyond its glass barrier. I knew then that Rule 7 wasn't about the potential sound it could hear. It was about what the sleepers could infer from every micro-action, every pattern of energy, every heartbeat. Even in silence, the unregistered figure was learning, adapting, and waiting for the slightest misstep. Haynes' presence beside me was the only buffer between compliance and catastrophe. I exhaled slowly, careful to keep my breathing shallow and measured, and continued down the corridor. The pod remained still, but the awareness it radiated was palpable, like a dense shadow pressing at the edge of perception. I realized that the rule extended beyond mere caution. It demanded near-perfect discipline. The lab itself seemed to respond to our adherence, the lights steady, the monitors stable, yet I could feel the ever-present possibility of failure looming. Even the tiniest verbal slip, even a whispered thought aloud, could undo hours of careful management. I glanced at Haynes, who gave a subtle nod of reassurance, though his eyes betrayed a deep, unspoken worry. The unregistered sleeper's gaze followed us as we moved, patient and deliberate, fully aware of every measured step. Rule 7 had ensured that we maintained a boundary, a fragile separation between observation and provocation. My muscles were tense, my pulse elevated, and yet the weight of the rule reminded me that silence was our only armor here. Any sound now would risk unraveling the delicate balance we had established. A faint ripple passed through the corridor floor, subtle but perceptible, and I froze. The pod didn't move outwardly, but the vibration suggested that the unregistered sleeper was aware of more than just physical presence. It was sensing energy, tension, intent. I realized then that Rule 7 was about more than speaking near a subject. It was about containing our humanity, about controlling every impulse that might betray us. Haynes adjusted the environmental settings slightly, his touch precise and careful, maintaining the boundary we had established. The lab felt charged with an almost tangible anticipation. Then a small reflection on the glass caught my eye, an imperfection in the light that seemed to shift unnaturally. I knew immediately that the unregistered sleeper had noticed it too, that it could extract meaning from even the tiniest detail. Haynes whispered to me, barely audible, "Keep silent, don't react, don't speak." I nodded, understanding fully that our survival depended on this perfect adherence. The awareness within the pod seemed to lean closer, patient, deliberate, calculating. The corridor itself felt like a cage, and every shadow threatened to remind us that the rule was absolute. And as we reached the far end of the corridor, the unregistered figure shifted slightly, a subtle, deliberate motion that made my blood run cold. I realized in that instant that even perfect silence hadn't erased our impact. The moment we approached, we had been observed, analyzed and cataloged. Rule 7 had kept us alive for now, but the consequences of our presence lingered like a pulse in the air, waiting for the next mistake, the next misstep, the next whisper. The first time I truly understood Rule 8, never record or photograph anything unapproved, I felt the weight of every camera, every sensor, every note I had ever taken in this lab pressed down on me. Haynes had left a few minutes earlier to check another section, and I instinctively reached for my tablet, thinking I could capture the subtle anomalies in the unregistered pod for later analysis. But the second my fingers brushed the screen, a cold realization struck me. Documenting this, capturing even the smallest detail, could provoke the sleeper or trigger systems designed to protect the unknown. The air in the corridor felt thicker, heavier, almost suffocating, and I forced myself to step back. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the pod's unregistered occupant, aware of how quickly a single photograph could turn precaution into danger. The figure inside didn't move outwardly, but there was an unmistakable tension in its posture, a subtle awareness that mirrored the hesitation in my own body. Haynes's voice came from around the corner, low but firm, reminding me that unauthorized documentation had led to incidents we still hadn't fully explained. I swallowed hard, understanding that Rule 8 wasn't merely about privacy or protocol. It was about containment, perception, and survival itself. I reluctantly placed the tablet back on the console, my hands trembling slightly. The pod seemed to respond immediately, shifting its orientation just enough to suggest recognition of the action. My pulse raced as I realized the magnitude of the risk I had taken, even momentarily. Haynes approached silently, glancing at me with a mixture of relief and warning. "You can't risk it," he whispered, barely audible. "Not here, not ever." I nodded, though the gravity of my near mistake pressed on me, the unregistered figure's subtle gaze following every micro movement I made. The corridor lights reflected sharply on the glass, creating illusions of movement where there were none, and I felt a cold certainty that capturing any detail could give the sleeper insights into us we weren't ready to share. Even the slightest flash, the faintest reflection, could be interpreted as an intrusion. I realized then that Rule 8 wasn't just about keeping records clean. It was about maintaining a fragile boundary between human curiosity and the awareness of something we could barely understand. The corridor felt alive, every shadow now loaded with consequence. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the pod, resisting the urge to document the strange distortions and subtle motions I could see within. The unregistered figure tilted its head, and I felt that knowing gaze brush against my consciousness. Haynes adjusted the environmental controls to stabilize the pod's atmosphere, his hands steady, but his eyes sharp. I realized that my instinct to record had been more than curiosity. It had been a threat to our safety. Rule 8 demanded that we act as though we were invisible, that our observation left no trace, no imprint, no evidence to provoke reaction. As I worked, I tried to focus entirely on the controls, forcing my mind away from the impulse to capture the anomalies visually. The unregistered sleeper's posture was deliberate, its subtle shifts almost imperceptible but calculated, as though testing my compliance with the rule. Every twitch of its fingers, every tilt of its head, seemed designed to measure hesitation, curiosity, or intent. I realized with chilling clarity that documenting its behavior without authorization could allow it to anticipate human actions in ways we couldn't predict. Haynes's shadow beside me reminded me that we were only safe as long as we followed every rule precisely. The monitors flickered faintly, displaying readings that didn't align with the capsule's actual environment. I resisted the urge to snap a photo of the anomaly, the tremor in my fingers betraying the internal struggle. Haynes's hand hovered over the override panel, his eyes scanning for irregularities, while silently reinforcing the lesson Rule 8 demanded. Knowledge gained improperly could be fatal. I understood fully now that every instrument, every device, every potential recording medium was a tool we had to restrain ourselves from using. Even the smallest act of documentation could invite disaster. I stepped back, allowing Haynes to take the lead on stabilizing the pod's life support, and felt a subtle tension in the lab air ease slightly. Yet the unregistered figure remained alert, watching, calculating, a silent reminder that the consequence of any unauthorized recording could manifest unpredictably. The corridor's lights cast long reflections that seemed to move independently, as if acknowledging my near breach of protocol. I realized then that Rule 8 wasn't about punishment, it was about preemptive defense against forces beyond comprehension. My mind raced with the implications, understanding that even an innocent mistake could leave permanent marks. As I watched the pod, I thought about previous incidents whispered among the senior staff, the stories of technicians who had captured images or recordings without authorization. Their disappearances were never fully explained, but the lab had remained eerily functional in their absence, as though enforcing the lesson of Rule 8 with quiet precision. I shivered, realizing that the rule wasn't a suggestion, it was a survival imperative. Even with Haynes beside me, the knowledge that I had almost violated it weighed heavily on my chest, an invisible reminder of the consequences lurking just beneath the surface. I adjusted the environmental settings again, deliberately avoiding any recording devices, focusing on maintaining stability rather than curiosity. The unregistered figure shifted subtly, an almost imperceptible movement that seemed to measure compliance and intent simultaneously. I understood that this wasn't merely observation, it was interaction without action, a silent acknowledgement that the boundary must never be crossed. Every micro-adjustment I made in the pod system carried the weight of consequence, reinforcing the importance of Rule 8 in ways words could never convey. A faint ripple passed through the corridor floor, subtle and deliberate, and I froze, sensing the unregistered figure's awareness extend beyond the pod. Haynes's hand pressed lightly on my shoulder, a reminder of our shared vigilance. I felt the corridor tighten around us, every reflection and shadow weighted with potential consequence. Rule 8 had reminded me that even observation without recording could have consequences, and my near breach had awakened an awareness we could not fully measure. I knew that one misstep here, one unapproved capture of data, could unravel hours of careful containment. The pod remained stable, but the subtle pressure of observation didn't ease. I moved deliberately, keeping my hands clear of any recording devices, forcing every thought to remain internal. Haynes monitored the console silently, his eyes reflecting the green glow of the corridor lights. I realized fully that Rule 8 demanded restraint, not just in action, but in intent, thought, and even perception. The lab itself seemed to lean toward compliance, a subtle acknowledgement that every precaution mattered, every rule existed for a reason, and every violation carried consequences beyond human reckoning. And just as I felt the tension ease slightly, the unregistered figure shifted again, its head tilting in a deliberate, calculated motion that made my chest tighten with dread. I knew in that instant that even nearly breaking Rule 8 had been observed, analyzed, and recorded in some incomprehensible way. The corridor seemed to press in, the lights reflecting every shadow, every detail of our presence. I realized that our adherence to the rules was fragile, temporary, and crucial. One misstep, and the knowledge we sought could transform into a weapon we weren't prepared to face. I had learned the hard way that Rule 9, never approach a pod that shows unusual heat signatures, wasn't a guideline. It was a lifeline. The monitors had started to flicker just as I rounded the corner toward the unregistered pod, showing faint thermal anomalies that I hadn't noticed before. My stomach twisted as I realized how quickly a moment of curiosity could become a disaster. Haynes had been checking the environmental systems nearby, but I was the one closest, and instinctively, I slowed my pace, remembering every incident he had warned me about. Even a single step too close could provoke something beyond human understanding. The air around the pod seemed warmer, charged, almost alive, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the lab pressing against my chest. I considered retreating, but curiosity anchored me in place, the subtle shifts inside the capsule demanding observation. Haynes's voice came, low and urgent. "Do not go near it. Remember Rule 9. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse race and every nerve on edge. The unregistered sleeper's head tilted slightly, a deliberate motion that seemed to measure my hesitation. The faint rise in temperature wasn't random, it was deliberate, a warning we were only beginning to understand. I inched backward slightly, trying to maintain a safe distance, but the subtle warmth seemed to reach out toward me, pressing against my awareness like a physical force. The corridor lights reflected off the capsule's glass, highlighting slight ripples in the internal environment. I realized that the unregistered figure wasn't simply reactive. It was aware, calculating, using even environmental changes to gauge intent. Haynes adjusted his position, monitoring the thermal anomalies with practiced precision, but the knowledge that I had approached the pod first weighed heavily. Rule 9 existed because even proximity could provoke consequences we couldn't control. The heat signatures fluctuated subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make me tense. I could feel the pod responding to my presence, the unregistered sleeper inside shifting in tiny deliberate motions that suggested comprehension beyond human capacity. My breath grew shallow, conscious that even the act of moving closer might encourage further reaction. Haynes's gaze never left the monitors, but I sensed his unspoken fear. I had learned that Rule 9 wasn't just about keeping distance. It was about controlling the interaction between awareness, proximity, and survival. I stepped sideways along the corridor, keeping the pod in my peripheral vision, noting the subtle increase in thermal readings. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, yet I couldn't ignore the patterns forming within the capsule. The unregistered figure's subtle flexing of its limbs mirrored my movements, almost as if it were learning from my response. The lab, once sterile and predictable, now felt like a living entity, reacting to each action. I realized then that Rule 9 demanded vigilance and discipline, because the moment we ignored the warning, the balance between observation and provocation shifted dangerously. Haynes spoke quietly, almost as if the pod could hear him, reminding me that even minimal interaction while observing thermal anomalies could be interpreted as a threat. I nodded silently, moving in slow, controlled steps to maintain a buffer zone. The unregistered figure inside remained motionless externally, yet its subtle movements, the flexing of fingers and head tilt, suggested it was fully aware of my proximity. I realized that ignoring Rule 9, even momentarily, could allow the sleeper to map human behavior and environmental reactions, creating opportunities for exploitation we weren't prepared to face. I glanced at the monitors again, watching the thermal patterns dance across the pod in almost organic ways. Every micro change seemed purposeful, designed to measure reaction. Haynes adjusted the life support systems, making subtle corrections to stabilize the environment, while silently reinforcing the boundary Rule 9 demanded. The corridor felt constricted, charged with anticipation, and I understood that proximity alone could provoke unpredictable consequences. The unregistered figure's awareness extended beyond the capsule, sensing intent, energy, and movement in a way that defied all logic. The warmth grew slightly, pressing against the edges of perception, like a living thing. I reminded myself to step back slowly, maintaining absolute control over every micro-movement, knowing that Rule 9 existed because even minor exposure could escalate beyond containment. The unregistered sleeper's gaze followed every motion, a quiet test of patience and obedience. I could feel the lab itself tightening around me, every light reflection and shadow now loaded with potential danger. Haynes's presence beside me was the only buffer between compliance and catastrophe, and even that felt tenuous. I stepped back cautiously, monitoring the fluctuation in heat signatures while keeping my eyes on the pod. The unregistered figure's posture shifted subtly, its head tilting in a deliberate, intelligent way. I realized that Rule 9 was more than precaution. It was about anticipating reaction and minimizing the risk of learning. Even a brief approach could allow the sleeper to recognize patterns, measure behavior, and test human response thresholds. The lab felt alive with tension, and I understood fully that my survival depended entirely on maintaining a strict buffer, observing but never provoking. A subtle ripple ran through the corridor floor, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me freeze mid-step. The pod responded instantly, as if aware of the movement, the pressure, the minute energy fluctuation caused by my presence. Haynes's hand brushed lightly against my arm, a silent reminder of the importance of distance. I realized that Rule 9 existed not just to prevent immediate danger, but to protect against the slow accumulation of risk created by repeated exposure. Every moment spent too close increased the potential for unpredictable consequences. I inched further back, each step deliberate, mindful of my breathing, of the lights reflecting across the pod, of the subtle heat waves it emitted. The unregistered figure's posture was calm, almost meditative, yet it exuded a keen intelligence, aware of every minor adjustment I made. I understood that Rule 9 was about survival, about maintaining a careful distance that limited interaction to observation without provocation. The corridor seemed to press inward with each heartbeat, the lab alive with the quiet awareness that proximity could awaken unknown consequences. Even as I moved away, the pod's heat signature fluctuated in ways that were deliberate and responsive, a constant reminder that our proximity was measurable, significant, and potentially dangerous. Haynes adjusted environmental controls silently, stabilizing the temperature while reinforcing the lesson embedded in Rule 9. I realized that even retreat had to be carefully controlled. Any sudden motion could be interpreted as aggression, a breach, or invitation. Every shadow, every reflection, every ripple of warmth mattered, and as I finally reached a point where the thermal readings normalized, I glanced back at the unregistered pod. Its occupant remained still externally, yet the awareness radiating from it pressed against the edges of perception, subtle and deliberate. Rule 9 had saved me, but I knew the boundaries were fragile, and one careless approach in the future could have consequences we weren't ready to face. The corridor's lights flickered slightly, and I felt a cold certainty that even a minor lapse could provoke a reaction that was irreversible. I had learned the hard way that Rule 10, never ignore the warning signals of a pod in lockdown, was more than a rule. It was a matter of life or death. The corridor lights flickered unevenly as I approached the locked pod, the monitors blaring subtle, insistent warnings that something inside was shifting beyond expected parameters. Haynes had been running checks on another section of the lab, leaving me momentarily alone with the pulsing red indicators. My pulse spiked, and I reminded myself of everything the rule demanded. Never bypass, never assume, never underestimate the signals meant to protect us. I paused beside the pod, studying the fluctuating readouts with a mix of dread and fascination. The warning signals weren't arbitrary. They reflected subtle energy fluctuations, temperature shifts, and unusual micro-movements within the unregistered sleeper. I remembered stories from senior staff, whispers of technicians who had dismissed the signals as glitches and paid for it with their sanity, or worse. My hands hovered near the console, hesitant, knowing that even the slightest misstep could provoke a reaction that would spread far beyond the pod itself. Rule 10 demanded vigilance, not just awareness. The unregistered figure shifted slightly inside the capsule, its head tilting toward the warning lights, as if it were aware of the implications. The tension in the air thickened, making my breath shallow and deliberate. Haynes returned briefly, signaling me to stay focused, though his expression betrayed the unease that had built between us over months of research. I reminded myself that the warning signals weren't merely precautionary, they were indicators of something alive and calculating, something that could detect hesitation and exploit it. Ignoring them was no longer an option. Compliance was survival. I adjusted the monitoring panel to assess the readings more accurately, keeping my movements deliberate and controlled. The pod's occupant remained still outwardly, but every micro-adjustment in the thermal and energy signatures suggested it was reacting to my attention. Rule 10 was clear. The moment we dismissed even minor fluctuations, the sleeper could leverage our inattention against us. I felt a cold pressure in my chest, realizing that the pod's subtle signals had become a test of patience, observation, and instinct. Haynes's presence beside me provided a thin layer of reassurance, yet the oppressive awareness from the pod was palpable. A series of lights blinked in a complex pattern, almost imperceptible, but my trained eye caught the irregularity immediately. I swallowed hard, remembering the previous incidents, where ignoring even a single pulse had led to catastrophic failures. I adjusted the environmental controls as carefully as possible, mindful of the sleeper's awareness of every motion. The corridor seemed smaller, the lab more confined, as though the walls themselves responded to the pod's internal warning signals. I understood that ignoring them was not merely careless, it was an invitation to disaster. I moved closer to the control console, monitoring the signals while keeping my distance from the glass. The unregistered figure's subtle posture changes suggested that it was aware of the readings, that it could sense not only our proximity, but our interpretation of the warning signals. Haynes whispered, almost to himself, that previous failures had shown how quickly a pod could escalate from minor anomaly to lethal situation if warnings were dismissed. I felt my pulse accelerate as I double-checked every system, ensuring that the pod remained isolated, contained and observed. Every indicator on the monitor pulsed with urgency, and I realized the warnings were not just technical, they were almost sentient, designed to communicate danger beyond human comprehension. The unregistered figure's gaze seemed to follow every light, every flicker, measuring response times and the precision of my actions. I understood fully then that Rule 10 was about more than observation. It was about reading, respecting, and obeying a language of alerts that existed beyond conventional understanding. Ignoring it could provoke consequences that even Haynes and I could not predict. I stepped back momentarily, assessing the fluctuations in the signals and cross-referencing them with prior containment logs. Even minor deviations triggered subtle micro-movements within the pod, each one deliberate, patient, and unsettlingly aware. The lab felt alive with tension, each shadow and reflection magnified by the pulsating warnings. Haynes's hand on the console reminded me that we were only as safe as our adherence to the rules, and Rule 10 was a boundary we could not afford to breach. One moment of carelessness could invite the unknown to manipulate conditions beyond our control. The air seemed to thicken as the signals continued their rhythmic variations, and I realized that the unregistered figure inside could detect more than visual cues. It understood pressure, energy, and intention. I adjusted the environmental control settings slowly, meticulously, while keeping my movements minimal. Every adjustment I made was observed and mirrored in subtle ways by the sleeper. The lab itself felt charged with latent energy, a constant reminder that ignoring even a single warning light could transform caution into catastrophe. I glanced at the monitors again, noting patterns that were both familiar and alien. The warnings pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost communicative, each blink and shift a silent message we were required to obey. Haynes remained beside me, silent but tense, reinforcing the importance of strict adherence. I reminded myself that Rule 10 was designed to prevent engagement with forces we could not control, and that even a second of inattention could escalate beyond recovery. The unregistered figure's gaze remained steady, patient, and disturbingly intelligent. The pod's occupant flexed its fingers subtly, tracing faint patterns along the internal surfaces, almost as if acknowledging the signals themselves. I understood that Rule 10 wasn't just a precaution, it was a defensive measure against intelligence that could exploit human error. Every pulse of the warning lights reminded me of how fragile our containment truly was, how quickly compliance could tip into provocation if we allowed the signals to be ignored. I adjusted the console's parameters again, ensuring that the pod's environment remained stable while keeping every thought focused and deliberate. A subtle vibration ran through the corridor floor, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make my pulse spike. I froze, realizing the unregistered figure could detect our presence in ways beyond sight or sound. Haynes's voice whispered a reminder, "Do not ignore it. Follow every signal." I nodded silently, feeling the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than ever. Rule 10 had become more than a rule. It was a tether to survival, a fragile lifeline, connecting us to the thin boundary that separated observation from disaster. The lights flickered again, and I noticed a faint distortion along the edges of the pod's glass. The sleeper's posture remained outwardly calm, yet its awareness radiated with precise intent, as if reading every adjustment I made in response to the warning signals. I understood fully that even a minor lapse in observation could trigger reactions that were immediate, subtle, and irreversible. Haynes adjusted the environmental parameters silently, and together, we maintained a careful, measured compliance that stretched each second into an exercise of patience, discipline, and vigilance. As I stepped back toward the corridor exit, I felt the oppressive weight of the pod's awareness lingering, a subtle, constant reminder that ignoring the warning signals could undo everything. Rule 10 had kept us alive, but its importance was undeniable, and I realized with chilling certainty that one mistake could turn the lab into a cage where nothing predictable could survive. The pod's occupant remained still, yet its presence was an ever-present calculation, waiting for the moment we faltered, testing boundaries we could not fully comprehend. I had always thought the final rule was simple, a matter of logistics and procedure, until Rule 11, never assume you can leave the lab, alone became horrifyingly clear. After hours of following every other rule, after ensuring the pods were stable and the warning signals heeded, I felt the pull of exhaustion and assumed I could step out for a moment. The corridor beyond the lab felt empty, the lights steady, the monitors silent in a lull that seemed almost welcoming. But as I approached the exit, the hairs on my arm stood up, a subtle, instinctive warning that Rule 11 existed, for reasons no manual could convey. I paused, listening to the steady hum of the facility, every thought focused on the silent understanding that leaving alone had consequences far beyond the immediate. Haynes was still in the lab, occupied with recalibrating a pod on the far end, and I assumed his presence would cover my absence. But as my hand grazed the metal door, a strange pressure filled the corridor, a sensation that the empty air itself was observing, aware of my intentions. I realized suddenly that Rule 11 wasn't about policy, it was about survival. Once a human stepped beyond the lab unsupervised, the unknown had ways of turning that freedom into a trap. The shadows along the corridor walls stretched oddly, their movement almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. I reminded myself of every story I had heard from former technicians, whispers of people who had left the lab alone and never returned. Their disappearances were never explained, and the facility seemed to erase their traces, as though compliance with Rule 11 extended beyond human observation. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the kind that made every instinct scream that I was no longer in control. My feet felt heavier with every step, as though the floor itself was resisting my movement, warning me against assumption. I turned back toward the lab momentarily, considering Haynes's proximity and the relative safety it offered. The pods were quiet, the corridors empty, yet I couldn't shake the sensation that the very air had shifted. Rule 11 wasn't about leaving the lab physically. It was about leaving the safety net of collective vigilance. Alone even for a moment, a technician became a variable the pods could measure, track, and exploit. I remembered the subtle shifts in the unregistered pod, the way it responded to proximity, to awareness, to intent, and I realized that stepping into the corridor unsupervised might invite consequences we could neither predict nor survive. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as I took another tentative step forward. Every breath felt weighted, every motion deliberate, but the corridor seemed different now. I could sense something unseen brushing against the edge of perception, subtle and deliberate, testing my compliance with the final rule. Haynes's distant figure offered some reassurance, but it was thin, almost imperceptible. Rule 11 demanded vigilance, not just in leaving, but in awareness, understanding that every step alone might be recorded, analyzed, and used against us. I paused near the door, gripping the handle as a subtle vibration ran through the floor. The air was charged, heavy, and yet motionless in a way that defied logic. I understood then that leaving the lab alone wasn't about the physical act. It was about exposure, about stepping outside the boundary of controlled observation. The unregistered figure's presence seemed to extend beyond its pod, reaching into the corridor in ways I could sense but not see. Rule 11 was absolute. To leave alone was to invite observation, manipulation, and the slow encroachment of an intelligence we couldn't comprehend. I considered retreating, moving back toward Haynes, yet the door's threshold loomed, a silent challenge. The corridor beyond felt alive, charged with an awareness that mirrored the pod's vigilance. I realized fully that Rule 11 extended beyond human understanding. Leaving unsupervised allowed the unknown to test limits, probe intent, and measure every micro-reaction. Even the simple act of opening a door became an interaction, a negotiation with forces we had no way to predict. My pulse raced, my hands tightened on the metal handle, and I could feel the weight of the final rule pressing in. I hesitated, 1 foot beyond the threshold, feeling the lab's air clinging to me like a tether. Every instinct screamed that moving forward alone would be catastrophic, yet the curiosity, the need to see beyond the boundary, pressed against my judgment. The pod seemed still, yet I could sense the subtle shifts of awareness extending outward. Rule 11 wasn't a simple guideline. It was the final wall between control and chaos, between observation and being observed. One misstep, one assumption, could dissolve the fragile balance we had maintained across 10 other rules. The lights flickered again, and I noticed shadows along the far walls that weren't quite right. They elongated, bent, and seemed almost to pulse in response to my hesitation. I could feel the corridor itself reacting to my presence, to my intent, to my assumption that I could move unsupervised. Haynes's distant voice called softly, but it didn't bridge the gap between the lab and the corridor, between safety and exposure. I realized with chilling clarity that Rule 11 demanded more than caution. It demanded a complete understanding that leaving alone was never safe, never permitted, and never predictable. I slowly withdrew my hand from the handle, retreating a few steps toward Haynes, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The unregistered pod's subtle awareness seemed to follow me, its intelligence palpable even through distance and glass. Rule 11 had warned that leaving alone was an act of vulnerability, one that could be measured, catalogued, and exploited. I felt the cold press of isolation, without even stepping fully into the corridor, understanding fully that the unseen presence of the pods extended beyond their physical containment. Even proximity to leaving alone had consequences. The air shifted subtly as I glanced back at the lab, the glow from the monitors casting uneven shadows. I felt an almost sentient pressure, as though the lab and its occupants were aware of every impulse, every step I considered, every assumption I made. Rule 11 was the final and most critical lesson. No one could leave alone without consequences we were not equipped to face. The corridor seemed infinite, oppressive and unwelcoming, a threshold between controlled observation and exposure to forces beyond comprehension. And as I finally turned fully back toward the safety of the lab, I felt it, a subtle, deliberate awareness brushing against the edges of my perception, closer than I could see, patient and unyielding. The pods remained contained, the corridor empty, yet something intangible pressed against the boundaries of understanding. Rule 11 had been reinforced in every lesson, every warning, every instinct, yet the lingering presence reminded me that leaving alone was never truly possible. Even in compliance, I could feel the pull of what awaited beyond patient, intelligent, and waiting for the next misstep. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.